here tonight. We're fortunate to have Neal Bascomb with us. Neal ventured in and is fortunate to be able to stay with family here in Nashville during his visit, so able to check off that box as well ahead of the holidays. Neal Bascomb is a national award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of a number of books, all nonfiction narratives, and all focused on inspiring stories of adventure or achievement. He's made a career writing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. His work has been translated into over 15 languages, featured in several documentaries, and optioned for major film and television projects. After graduating from Miami University in Ohio, he worked as a journalist in London, Paris, and Dublin until becoming a full-time writer. He is the author of our all-school summer reading book, The Race of the Century, and he'll speak to the boys tomorrow in assembly about that. He's here tonight to discuss The Winter Fortress, the epic mission to sabotage Hitler's atomic bomb. Mr. Bascomb lives in Philadelphia with his family, and when he's not researching or writing, he enjoys skiing and hiking. So please join me in welcoming him to MBA.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on such a gloriously lovely day. I should come down to Nashville more often. I'm always a little bit nervous talking, even after doing this for 20-odd years, but since tomorrow I'm speaking in front of 850 teenage boys, I think I can handle this crew here tonight. William asked me what I wanted to speak to you all about this first evening, and I thought it was appropriate to venture into this story about the sabotage of the German atomic bomb program, because it's really a story about patriotism and why people fight. And given everything going on in Ukraine and all the savagery we're seeing there, I felt like it was a good time to sort of revisit why people are willing to risk their lives for their country. So as much as this is a story about atomic physics and heavy water and sabotaging a bomb, it's a story about these individuals who are fighting for their country in Norway and the extraordinary things they did to go about doing that. I'm going to start by reading a letter written by Leif Tronstad, who was a chemist who ended up leading these operations against the Germans in Norway. A Norwegian chemist, and he escaped to England to set up to fight. And he was away from his family for years, and he left his two children and his wife back in Oslo. And his daughter, Sitzel, couldn't quite understand why he was away, why he would be willing to leave the country, leave them there, why he was fighting. And so he wrote this letter to her. And I think it's a great way to start tonight's lecture. We have to do everything for our land to make it free again. When we say our fatherland, we just don't mean the land which is beautiful and we also love, but also everything we love at home, mother, little boy, and you, and all the fathers and mothers and children. I also mean all the wonderful memories from the time we ourselves were small, and from later when we had children of our own, our home villages with the hills and mountains and forests, the lakes and ponds and rivers and streams and waterfalls and fjords. The smell of dew, the smell of new hay in summer, of birches in the spring, of the sea and the big forest, and even the biting winter cold. Everything. Norwegian songs and music and so much, much, much more. That's our fatherland, and that's what we have to struggle to get back. So let's talk atomic physics. Who's ready? Any atomic physicists here this evening? No, thank goodness. Because I'm going to keep this very simple, okay? This whole story is about the sabotage of a heavy water plant in Norway, which was a linchpin of the German atomic bomb program. And so what's heavy water? Heavy water, you have regular water that you can drink, H2O. Heavy water, D2O, deuterium, is an isotope or variant of hydrogen. It has a proton and electron just like hydrogen, but it also has a neutron, which makes it heavier. And the reason why this was important is in order to foster a chain reaction, you need something to slow down the flinging around neutrons, and heavy water does that perfectly, while normal water just absorbs it. And so heavy water was an instrumental ingredient in both the German atomic bomb program and the American atomic bomb program. After all, it was the bomb at Nagasaki, which was the plutonium bomb, which was what a heavy water reactor will ultimately produce. Now, the German atomic bomb program, I don't know how much you know about it, but Werner Heisenberg, the individual on the far left, is supposed to be the great physicist he was. He was a Nobel Prize winner. Everyone thought that he was the one leading the German atomic bomb program. And there's lots of controversy over whether or not he was actually interested in building a bomb for Hitler or not. But it doesn't really matter, because the individual on the far right, Dr. Kurt Diebner, was the head of the German atomic weapon research program. For years in the 1930s, he had been pushing the Nazi Reich to invest more in atomic research because he was convinced that an atomic bomb was possible. And so he found himself really at the center of this story. And in 1940 or 1939, as we begin to understand heavy water and its use in fostering a chain reaction, Diebner wants to create a heavy water reactor, but he needs heavy water. And there's one place in the whole world that produces heavy water in any substantive quantities, and that's at a place called Vermont. It's about 100 miles west of Oslo. It's surrounded by 3,500 miles of basically Arctic tundra, and it's very hard to create heavy water there. There's a heavy water molecule, one heavy water molecule for every 41 million molecules of regular water. And so you need a place with a lot of power and a lot of water. And this facility, built in 1940, provided exactly that. Now, when the Germans came, and Kurt Diebner came to the Norwegians and said, "We need all the heavy water you have," and the Norwegians said, "Well, what do you need it for?" And Diebner would not reveal it. And so the Norwegians said, "Well, you can't have any at all." In 1940, in the spring, the Germans invaded Norway, rather rapidly took over the country. Kurt Diebner and his men went straight to Vermont and began to increase production of heavy water there very rapidly. Twofold first, fourfold, tenfold, 20-fold the amount of heavy water. Enough, he had hoped, within 6 months to a year to have enough to create a working reactor. Now, the problem that Kurt Diebner had was Leif Tronstad. Now, Leif was one of 7 children. His father passed away early in his life. He was raised by his mother. He was a bit of an early genius, graduated high school at 14, studied physics and chemistry in England and in Germany. And he came back, and he was already married in his late 20s. And he told his wife, Bassa, "I can do 2 things. 1, I can teach, or 2, I can go into industry and make a lot of money." And Bassa asked him what he really wanted to do, and he said, "I want to teach." And so that's exactly what Leif Tronstad did. He became a professor, but Leif was a very vigorous man. He was always doing much more than he needed to, and so very quickly found himself also at the heart of Norwegian industry. Part of that was building Vermont and the heavy water factory. So it was his design that created the factory, and it was an absolute disaster once he finished, a financial, economic disaster, because people didn't know what to do with heavy water at that point. There's a joke in the area around Rjukan, where Vermont is located, that really the only use for heavy water is to build a skating rink. Because heavy water freezes at a higher temperature. It was a disaster, of course, until nuclear fission was discovered and the use of heavy water. So Leif Tronstad is in Norway when the Germans come. He wants to fight. So he escapes, he joins the underground, resistance movement in Norway, fights there for a period of about 4 months, ultimately discovers that he's being targeted by the SS, takes his family from Trondheim down to Oslo, secures them in a house in the countryside, and then leaves them. He's planning on going to England. He skis to the Swedish border. He gets on a plane, ultimately arrives in London. And really what the British want him for is research. They want to use his expertise, his brilliance in chemistry, to be part of any nuclear program or any weapons programs. But Leif wants to actively participate in the resistance against the Germans in Norway. And so very quickly, this chemist with absolutely no military experience whatsoever finds himself at the heart of the Norwegian and British nexus of commando forces. So in England, you have what is famously the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, it's called. They were the commandos. They were the ones who went behind enemy lines and blew up bridges and factories and facilities and the like. Leif Tronstad runs a company called Company Ling, which is a group of Norwegians who have escaped Norway, gone to England to be trained to fight as special forces. And so there he is, working hand in glove with Colonel Wilson, the head of Norwegian SOE. Now at this point, this is now moving forward a little bit, 1942. Now in 1942, the Americans knew that a bomb was possible. The Germans very much knew that a bomb was possible. And they were both about equal level in terms of their research and their knowledge of how to go about doing it. They both understood that a heavy water reactor was one critical way to produce weapons grade material. Now in April 1942, I love this letter because I scoured the archives in England and Norway and all these little tidbits and letters that you find. But this little statement from the Two Alloys High Commission, which was the British version of the Manhattan Project, sends a note to Churchill saying, and I quote, the most understated line, "Since recent experiments have confirmed that element 94, which is plutonium, would be as good as U-235 for military purposes, and since this element is best prepared in systems involving the use of heavy water, the committee recommends that an attempt should, if possible, be made to stop Norsk Hydro production in Vermont." Churchill and Roosevelt get together. In June 1942, they have two major items to discuss. The foremost one, of course, is the invasion of mainland Europe, but the other is what to do and how to proceed with the development of atomic weapons. And Churchill writes in his memoirs of this eerie, sinister term called heavy water. Didn't quite understand what it was, but he understood from his people that that the German supply of it needed to be eliminated at all costs. And this is really what begins the story of this sabotage. Now, if the British had a secret weapon with Leif Tronstad had a secret weapon with this individual here, Einar Schinnerland. Einar was born at the dam just outside of Vermont, which provides the water for the heavy water plant. He was born in this area where you sort of, you grow up with skis on your feet, right? He was an expert hunter. He was an expert winter survivalist. He was also an engineer. Like many young Norwegians, he wants to fight. And so he decides, he hears this rumor that a lot of people are going over to England and being trained, and so he wants to participate that. And he has I love this marvelous smile on Einar because he was he looks very boyish here, but he was probably one of the toughest people I've ever experienced in getting to know in my research. He decides he wants to fight. He goes down. He's living with his parents. He's 23 years old. He says, I'm going to go out on a hunting vacation. I'll be gone for 2 weeks up in the Vita, in the Arctic tundra. Instead of going north, he goes southwest to the coast. Along the way, skiing, hundreds of miles, by the way, he somehow has an accident and mangles up his knee. He can barely walk. Einar gets to the coast. He meets up with a couple of resistance members who have decided they are going to hijack a German steamer and steam their way to Britain. Now, Einar is in terrible shape. He's in no shape to take over a ship, but he says, well, I'm participating, I'm going. And the guys who he's going with say, well, you need to go see a doctor. And so he goes to the doctor, and the doctors say, you need surgery. You're going to be out for however long. And Einar says, no, I need to go tomorrow. And the surgeon says, well, there's no way, the recovery, the anesthesia, everything. And Einar says, I want you to operate. And so Einar has an operation on his knee without any anesthesia. He recalls it being the most excruciating pain he ever experienced, of course. He hobbles his way out of the hospital later that evening. 12 hours later, he's taken over the steamer with 3 other men, makes his way across to Britain. Now, Einar thinks that he's going to be trained as a commando. He believes that he's going to probably be there for 6 months or so. He's going to learn how to fight. Of course, he's an engineer. He has no military experience. But Leif Tronstad hears that there's a young man from the Rjukan area who happened to arrive on British shores. He sends for him. Einar comes down by train to London, meets with Leif Tronstad in his office, and Leif Tronstad tells him that he's returning in 1 week. They are going to give him rudimentary training, parachute training. He's going to jump out of a plane. They give him rudimentary radio transmission training. And a week later, he's on a Halifax bomber, cruising over the North Sea on his way back to Norway, still with that knee. Now, what I love about this story is not only the sort of grit and determination of this, but you read and you watch movies of World War II, and everyone's sort of gung-ho and there's no fear. Well, the problem with Einar was he was afraid of heights. So Einar's in this Halifax bomber. Door opens, and now he needs to drop out. And he remembers being absolutely paralyzed with fear, and he wouldn't move. I mean, he was gripping the edge of the sides of the plane, wouldn't go. And eventually, the dispatcher kicks him in the butt, and he flies through the door down. Einar comes down, lands again on that bum knee, skis back to his house. He's now been only gone 2 weeks. Just as he's told his parents. How was your hunting vacation? It was wonderful, thank you. And so begins Einar's role as a SOE, Company Ling spy. Probably one of he was underground for 3 years, probably the longest of any SOE agent in Europe. I can't say that definitively, but it was an extremely long time. He found himself a job at the Norsk Hydro dam and electricity, and is conveying back by radio transmission everything you need to know about this plant. Every stairwell, every door lock, guard rotations, how the supply is being increased. They would joke back at SOE headquarters that Einar provided so much information that they could duplicate that plant just by his reports. And so now Leif and the British have everything they need to know to go about planning a mission to take down the plant. How to do that is the big question. Now, the Americans, in sort of typically American fashion, they just want to bomb it to smithereens, right? They want to do a daytime mission and just send down a bunch of bombs and absolutely destroy it. Safe, quick, efficient. The issue is, Tronstad says, one, You can't see it, but if you ever get yourself to Rjukan, it's an absolutely glorious place. It's a slotted valley. It's very steep. There's a town of Rjukan in the southern part of that at the base. It's almost dark there 365 days a year. There's very little sunlight. 5,000 people live there. And the plant itself is essentially a fortress, as my title says. I mean, it's built of tens of thousands of pounds of steel and concrete, and the heavy water facility is in the basement. So Tronstedt says, if you bomb it, you're going to do two things. You're going to kill a lot of civilians, and you're never even going to cause any damage to the heavy water facility. So they talk about all this. This is not Einar, actually. He did not have a camera crew with him. But this is a SOE agent dropping in on a mission. This is where Einar would have landed. This is the Vida, the 3,500 miles of I've cross-country skied there quite a bit, and it's not a pleasant place. So what to do? Leif convinces them not to bomb. The British, Leif wants to send in 4 Norwegians, these gentlemen who are from the Rjukan area or around it, and send them in to sabotage it. The problem is the British do not believe that the Norwegians are good enough to do it. They don't think they have enough experience. They've only recently been trained. And so they want to send in 2 teams of 15 Royal Engineers to go in by glider, being dropped by glider, onto this lovely landscape, and then reach the heavy water facility and blow it up. Leif thinks this is an absolute ridiculous idea, but the British are pretty keen on this idea. They have so much misunderstanding about this territory that they believe that they could send in the glider bicycles, so that the men could drop in November of 1942, take the bicycles out of the glider, bike their way down to the plant, blow it up, bike their way out, and be clear. That is not going to happen. What Leif manages to do is convince them to send an advance team to go ahead, the Grouse team. These 4 gentlemen here, Jan Anton Paulsen, Knut Haukelid, Knut Haugland on the far right, and Arne Helstrup. Again, as I said, they know the area. 2 of them are directly from Rjukan. And so they train, they drop in to the area in late October 1942. They have, I believe, something along the lines of like 300 pounds of equipment with them that they have to carry 10 miles to a landing spot that the British think is the best place to bring them. And so they managed to reach the spot in the amount of time. It was an excruciating journey. They would carry something like 30 pounds with them, go 2 miles, drop it off, ski back, pick up the next 30 pounds, ski it back the 2 miles, pick up, you get it, and leapfrog their way, finally, 10 miles through this winter wonderland, and finally arrive at the drop site. These are the Royal Engineers, one of the companies, sent in for what was called Operation Freshman. It was called Operation Freshman because a glider had never been used in military operations before by the Allies. And so now they were going to send 2 gliders in to the tundra there, drop them off. These were very brave young men. They were told by their commander they had no idea where they were going. They were given very little ski training. They had no idea what the purpose of the mission was other than to blow up a factory. They were not told about heavy water or nuclear bombs or anything. They were told that if the mission was successful, it could be a decisive factor in the course of the war. To a man, they all stepped forward and volunteered. Nobody backed down. On November 19th, 1942, they took off from Britain in these Horsa gliders. The glider there, you see, it was what many called a wooden coffin. It had a corrugated steel floor because it was like riding a bucking bronco. Everyone would just get sick. You would be tossed around left and right in it. And imagine doing that over the North Sea and when the weather gets bad. And unfortunately for these men, the weather got absolutely abysmal. They were told that the landing site was clear, which it was in the morning when Newt Hogland radioed that all was clear and they could come. The weather changed at the drop of a hat. By the time they arrived over the landing site, they couldn't see it. The clouds had dropped in. They were landing at night, and they had no idea. They could not find the spot. The radio beacon wasn't working, but they knew they needed to drop. Unfortunately, they circled around one too many times. One of the lines broke, connecting the Halifax to the glider. The glider was lost and slammed into a mountain. The other glider released its line, also crashed. One of the Halifax bombers circled around to see if they could find the men or any sign of them. That Halifax bomber also crashed into a mountain. 41 men died that evening. It was an absolute disaster on every level. Roughly 10 survived on the ground. They were captured by the Germans. They were tortured viciously and summarily executed. So beyond being a tragedy of life and limb and these men, it was also a tragedy for this mission because now the Germans knew that people were coming to blow up the plant. And so what had already been a fortress in and of itself, they doubled the guard, they laid minefields up on the mountain coming down, they refortified the single-lane bridge that connected the heavy water facility to the opposite valley. It became an impregnable fortress. Not 24 hours later, Leif Tronstadt and Colonel Wilson went to their commanders and said, "We want to take over this mission. We want to be in control of it." And at this point, the British SOE, the High Command, wanted to basically wash their hands of this. They've had this tragedy, they've had this disaster, they're not sure anything is possible. Leif says, "We will send in some Norwegians, we will sabotage this, we can make it work." And so he assembles this group of 6 men, and I can count, there's one missing, he's next. What was called Operation Gunnerside. It was led by a 24-year-old Joachim Ronenberg, bottom right here, with that little flash on his arm. Again, no military experience. He was from a very wealthy family. He was well-schooled. He was a heck of a skier, but again, no experience. He trained in England. He became so good at all the exercises that they put him in charge of all the Norwegians. And so when an operation came forward, he volunteered to lead it. His second in command was this individual here, Knut Haukelid, who was born in Brooklyn, moved back to Norway when he was 5 years old. And he was, well, everything you need to know about Knut Haukelid you can discover in his nickname. His nickname was Bonzo. Bonzo was very cunning. He was a risk taker. He fought in the underground resistance for 2 years before eventually going over to England to be trained. So they put together this operation, Joachim Ronenberg, now in November, December, January, assembling everything he needs. He's very meticulous, everything down from the kind of socks that the men would wear to he designed his own sleeping bags because none that the British were using were of any use. And they actually ended up building a mock plant of the heavy water facility, thanks to Skinnerland's information, and they trained on it day and night and day and night. They were supposed to go in December, but because of the weather in Norway that year, they had the worst winter they had had in 100 years. It was an absolute abomination. And so they couldn't land, they couldn't drop. The issue is you have Operation Grouse still on the ground. When the tragedy of Operation Freshman concluded, they escaped to the Vita, this tundra. A place is I guess one quote is, it gets so cold so fast there that flames freeze in the fire. It is a place where the only thing that really lives there is moss and reindeer during the winter. It's a place that these four men had camped in the summertime, but by no means lived for 3 months without any support, and that's exactly what they had to do. They escaped scores of miles up north. There was a manhunt instituted by the SS. They couldn't find them. They ended up bunkering down in this cabin that you see here for 3 months. They had no food, no supplies. They had a radio, but they had no batteries. They survived on two things. One, Skinnerland would occasionally find his way up there and bring new batteries so that they could transmit to England. And secondly, they hunted. They were starving by Christmas of 1942. They believed that they weren't going to be able to make it. Jan Anton Paulsen, who grew up as a pretty bit of a master hunter, ended up bringing down a reindeer, and they survived on reindeer, every part of it, for 3 months. That was their food. They became connoisseurs of reindeer. If anyone wants to know the most delicious part of a reindeer, apparently to the saboteurs, it's the fatty part of the eyelid. It was so cold that the inside hoarfrost was growing in over the course of the winter, so that they would have to chip at it in order to provide themselves more space. But it was critical that they survived because they were the link to this new team that was coming in. They were the ones that would be ready on the ground to receive them and bring them to the plant, because no one from Gunnerside was from this area. And so they needed Operation Grouse to be on hand. Eventually, in February of 1943, after surviving that winter, Gunnerside's lands, again, a horrible blizzard. It was so strong that Ronenberg remembers being lifted off his feet and thrown backwards. They rejoined up with grouse. They made their way to this cabin, which overlooks the heavy water plant you see here. Now, the question is what to do. Again, we're not going to bomb it, we're going to sabotage it, but we need to find our way into the plant. All these men thought that this was a suicide mission. They thought that they could probably get in. They could probably fight their way in, but there was no way that they would fight their way in and get themselves out. So over the course of a day, they sketched out how they were going to go about hitting this plant. They had three options. As I mentioned before, there was a single-lane suspension bridge that connected this side of the valley to the plant itself. It was guarded by machine gun nests, double the guard, of course, as I mentioned, because of the knowledge that the Germans had that the Allies wanted to sabotage this plant. They quickly realized that that was not going to be possible. The second option was to come down. These are the pipes that provide water to the power station and to the heavy water facility. They thought that they could go across and then come down here. But Skinnerland advises them that the Germans have mined that whole area, everywhere. And they have guards all stationed all along that line. So again, it's not going to be possible. Now, the third option that Leif Tronstadt came up with back in England, they had taken aerial photos of all the Rjukan area in order to plan out this operation. Leif Tronstadt remembers seeing some trees, some shadows of some trees in the valley. And his idea was, if trees can grow, men can climb. And so his idea was to go down this valley, up the side, and then across this railway line, which Rjukan is here, let's say, and there's a railway line here that goes. So they were going to go down and then come up and go across. Jan Anton Paulsen and Knut and Klaus Hellberg, who were from Rjukan, who were allowed by their parents to go camping on their own as 12-year-olds in this area, were always told, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. Were told by their parents, never, under any circumstances, are you to climb this valley. This is off limits. At one point, when Paulsen was 10, a car careened off the road went over the side of this, and it took ropes and climbers to retrieve the bodies from the crashed vehicle. So it is extremely steep, it is extremely dangerous, and now the idea is they're going to climb down this and then climb back up. Ronenberg does not want to do it. He decides that this is not possible and their best shot is to go across the bridge. Bonzo, of course, urges that this is the best route. If they're going to have any chance of surviving, any chance of getting out, they need to go up this very, very steep valley. Ronenberg, who's 24, as I mentioned, the commander of all these 10 men, takes a vote, which is a very odd thing to do, takes a vote and says, what do you want to do? They all decide, overwhelmingly, to climb up the valley. So that is exactly what they do on the evening of February 27th. They ski down. This is from the opposite side. They go down, they reach this river that runs through the valley. Ronenberg remembers that evening. It was freezing, snow was coming down, it was very dark, the moon was hidden, and he remembers looking up and recalling that it looked like being in New York when he visited in the 50s. It looked like they would have to scale a skyscraper. That's how sort of steep it looked. But they managed to do it. They came up and made their way across. They divided into two teams of four. These were the demolition teams, and two men were covering them. They knew every part of this plant. They break themselves in. They go to the door that's supposed to be left open, and it's locked. Now, of course, they know every part of this plant. Ronenberg decides that there's a channel of pipes that they can crawl through and drop themselves into the heavy water factory. That's exactly what they do. They drop in. There's no guards there. The Germans never thought in any way that it was possible to reach this part of the plant without being discovered. There was a lone Norwegian foreman there. He, of course, said, have your way with it. They planted bombs all through the heavy water facility and then ran. Burst themselves out of the main door, careened themselves down here. They basically dove down this valley, skied all the way across here, and then made their escape up into the Vita. Now that's half the story. I will not keep you here all evening because, again, it's lovely out. But I will tell you, I will make sort of 3 points that really stood out to me in this story about these gentlemen. One was their toughness. There's a story of Klaus Hellberg after the sabotage. All the men escape. None are injured. They make their way into the Vita. Ronenberg takes 6 of them. They ski across to the Swedish border over 14 days in this epic journey. 4 of them stay. All the members of Grouse, or 5 of them stay. All the members of Grouse and Bonzo stay. Klaus Hellberg goes to Oslo undercover and then decides to make his way back into the Vita to collect arms and bombs and explosives that they have to help with the resistance. He skis 25 miles to this cabin where they had stored all the stuff. He's in the hut getting everything ready when he sees a German patrol coming straight to the hut. Gathers his things, takes off, believes, this is my land, this is my territory, I can make a quick escape. He makes a quick escape from all of them except for a lone Austrian skier who's every bit as good and as good a shape as Klaus Hellberg. So for hours, these 2 men are skiing, cross-country skiing, chasing each other up through this Vita, up. Klaus decides or discovers that whenever he goes up a hill, he gains distance, and whenever he goes down a hill, the Austrian catches up with him. So he tried to climb every possible hillock he could find in this area to get himself away. Eventually, he tires of it, stations himself in such a way that the setting sun is in the Austrian's eyes, and he stops. He waits for the German to fire on him. The German misses, or the Austrian misses. Klaus Hellberg takes 1 shot, downs the Austrian, and then takes off again. He knows very well that those other German soldiers will alert their commanders, and there will be a massive manhunt for him. So he's now skiing his guts out. He falls off a cliff 100 feet, shatters his shoulder, gets up, skis with one hand, one pole, about 50 more miles that evening. Just tough, survives, finds himself, I won't go too much in this, finds himself in a hotel, finally warm, and the Germans take over that same hotel that evening. He makes a dramatic escape off a bus, but that's for another time. The second thing is sacrifice. Now, Skinnerland just is one example. I mean, 2 of his brothers were taken by the SS. His best friend was taken by the SS. They were tortured and never gave away Einar. But I want to talk about Knut Haukelid. Knut Haukelid went underground in Oslo, too. He went to an old friend's apartment to stay and to sort of settle down. He gets there, he spends the night. In the morning, there's a knock on the door. And his friend answers the door, and Knut hides away in the back, in the bedroom. And Knut hears a voice. It's his father coming into the room. He hears his father's voice. Now, Knut had been underground now for 3 years. Had left his wife, his parents, his friends, had not seen any of them. If he had any contact with them, he knew that they would be in deep trouble. And so he recalls being in that bedroom and listening to his father joke with his friend and wanting more than anything in the world to open that door and go out and to hug his father and just to be with him and spend time with him. But he knew that he couldn't. Not a month later, Knut Haukelid's father was taken by the SS. He was tortured. He was eventually released, but died of his injuries soon after. Knut dedicated his memoir of his experiences to his father, and the dedication was rather succinct. He died not knowing why. The last thing I'd bring up is teamwork. And in particular, grouse. These 4 men who survived in this cabin for 3 months in this wintertime. And let me tell you, they gave up hope several times. They wanted to leave. They knew that they could ski into Rjukan. They had family. They had friends there. They could get food. But they understood that if they did that, they would put everyone at risk as well as themselves. And so they stayed in this cabin in this terrible winter where it's dark 18 hours a day, where the frost and the ice is growing in on them. And they were going slightly mad. They would recall dreaming of heaping platters of food being carted into the room and then waking up to being, their frozen tundra. And Paulson knew at a certain point in January, late January, that the men were giving up and he needed to do something. And so over the course of 2 weeks, he just began talking with them. And he would give them a lecture on hunting. His family had a lecture of the 10 sort of edicts of a good hunter, and he made them memorize that. And then he had Klaus Hellberg recite poetry. Klaus considered himself a bit of an amateur poet, and so Klaus would just, make them smile and laugh with his terrible poetry. Arne Helstrup was a plumber prior to the war. These men, after the war, they said they could fix any pipe, any toilet, by virtue of Arne's many lectures on plumbing. Knut Haukelid, who was a remarkable individual in his own right, not only for this mission, the radio transmission, he was a radio operator. He was also involved in the Kon-Tiki expedition. He taught them how everything they needed to know about transmission and radios and breaking them down and everything. That's all to say that as a team, they kept each other alive, and they had to, because they knew that if they could not survive, the chances of Gunnerside ever operating or ever being successful simply would not have happened. Now, was this operation important? I wrote a whole book about it, so arguably I will say yes. But there's many people talk about, well, the Germans didn't really want to bomb, or they weren't willing to invest in it in the way that the Americans, and they didn't have the resources that we had. to develop the Manhattan Project. You know, and in many respects, that's true. In June 1942, Albert Speer makes the decision that the Germans are not going to go forward with a program that's going to invest all of their industry into creating a bomb like we did. That said, Kurt Diebner is told that if he can get a heavy water reactor going, if he can get plutonium from a heavy water reactor, that they will, quote unquote, shower him with every resource needed to build a bomb. So you could argue on one side or the other. We won't know. But this mission that these men succeeded in doing vanquished any chance that the Germans would have of ever obtaining a bomb. Now I'll conclude with Tronstadt, who over the course of his time in England fought his superiors over and over and over and over again to send him back to Norway. Again, he wanted to be on the ground, boots on the ground, fighting. He was too valuable to do that, and so they kept him in England until 1945, where he finally, I think, just wore them down. He parachuted into Norway, assembled a small resistance army in this same area, and was going to be there ready for when the Allies freed Norway. He was ultimately killed in the late winter that year by a collaborator. He was shot, and he never got to see Norway freed. Before he left to go back into Norway to fight, he wrote a letter to his wife, Bassa, and put it in his safe and told his secretary that, you know, if he was to pass, if he was to be killed, that he wanted his wife and his children to have this letter. And I became very close with Leif's son in Norway, who's a champion of his father's legacy, and I promised him when he gave me almost everything there is to know about his father, diaries, letters, all. Leif kept the diary every single day from the moment the Germans invaded Norway until the time of his death. And his son had all those diaries. And I promised his son, Leif Jr., that I would read this letter that his father wrote. And I think it's a fitting ending to this speech. Dearest Bassa, I have the honor to lead an important expedition home, which will be of great importance to Norway's future. It is in line with the course I chose on April 9th, 1940, to put all my effort and abilities toward our country's welfare. The war is singing its last verse, and it requires every effort from all who would call themselves men. You will understand that, won't you? We have had so many magical, happy years together, and my highest wish is to continue that happy life together. But should the Almighty have another course for me, know that my last thought was of you. Time is short, but if all will not go well, don't feel sorry for me. I am completely happy and thankful for what I have had in life, even though I would very much would like to live to help Norway back to its feet. And then he wished Sitzel and Leif, his children, well, and he said he would look forward to seeing them again, and the letter was signed, Your Beloved. Thank you very much. I apologize that I haven't given that talk in a while, so I went on longer than I usually do, but I would love to entertain any questions that you all have, and hopefully I can answer them on anything from the writing to the story or whatever comes to mind. Yes, sir.
I look forward to reading the book. Does the book paint the broad picture of that area of Norway and the war? And if not, it was real zoned in on this story. Does it paint a broader picture, or do you recommend a good book that would read about the wider circumference of that area and Norway and all that?
Yeah, get off the top. I mean, the answer to that question is yes and no. Like, I definitely go into the invasion of Norway, why it happened, how the Germans were so successful in taking it over. I go into the Norwegian resistance and how widespread it was. I mean, it was everywhere. I mean, these guys were fighting tooth and nail. So yes, I address it wider, but of course I hone in on this particular story. So I can, not off the top of my head, but in the bibliography, you'll see many references to better books if you want to know the Norway story. Yes, ma'am.
Is the facility still there today? Is it operational? In what capacity is it available?
I'm sorry, I love this photo, so I'm just going to highlight it there. The heavy water factory itself has been, let me see if I can get there it is. This is a heavy water factory, okay? These are electrolysis machines here, and then the actual final stages were in the basement, as I mentioned. This is the power plant, the water power plant. That is still extant. That's still there. This was torn down. They have since recovered some of the basement, and the Norwegians are actually in the process now, and it's been a few years since I've been there. It may now be recovered and open. There is a wonderful museum there, and if you just ever find yourself in Norway, as I said, it's glorious countryside. I wouldn't recommend it in January unless you love to ski, but it's a lovely place to go, and all this history is imbued in everything there. Anybody else?
Why a heavy water plant in its existence originally? Did you say? What was the reason you would have a heavy water plant if you're Norway?
It was originally built by Tronstad. So heavy water was discovered in the early 30s, this isotope, and people didn't know what its use was. Some believed that it could be very useful in treating cancer. There were various other sort of harebrained schemes of what heavy water could be used for. Tronstad didn't care. He actually, would tell his students that, I think the line is first experimentation, then industry. So he was a scientist, right? He just wanted to see if it could be done and done on scale. And so he managed to succeed in that effort. And I've read the balance sheets of Norsk Hydro in that period of time. Again, it was an economic disaster for them. And then suddenly, when it was discovered that heavy water could be used in fishing research, then it sort of leapt. I think I saw a hand. Yes, sir.
How did you first connect to this story to start following it? And how long of your life have you spent looking at research?
So I have I've little interests that one of my interests is the atomic history. I don't know why. I've read a lot of atomic history. I find it fascinating. I probably read Richard Rhodes' book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, 3 times, and if you've ever read it, it's a massive tome. I remember reading it the 3rd time, and I was in the midst of that sort of awkward phase of looking for my next book idea. And so during that phase, I'm sort of constantly on the lookout. And the story of the sabotage of the Norwegian plant takes up a few pages in Rhodes' book. But I remember reading it again and thinking to myself, wow. I mean, that's an incredible story. And I often find that, it's these little slivers of stories that if you expand out, they accomplish 2 things. One, they make tremendous narratives. Like, it just seemed like this would be a tremendous narrative read. And secondly, it's a way to explore the wider world. So Norway during the war, atomic science and the making of the bomb. And so that sort of was my way into this story. This book it typically takes me between 2 to 4 years, depending on the subject for each book. This one took about 3.5. And largely because I hit the jackpot. Like, as I was mentioned with Leif Tronstadt, I remember meeting him for the first time and going into his house outside of Oslo. We had a nice conversation, talked about it. And these things are always, they're almost courtships in a way, right? When you're meeting either direct people in your story or family, and you're trying to get archival information. And so we have a nice conversation. And it apparently went well enough. He said, "Come with me." And I had no idea what he had. And he takes me down a hallway to his office, and he opens the door. And in his office is this a wall of shelves, all with black binders, full. And they're all of his father's diaries, his letters, a lot of contraband that he had that the son had taken, from Norwegian, that he had collected over the years. Maybe he shouldn't have had, maybe not, but he did. And so it just was, and the Norwegians had a lot of their own material. All of it was in Norwegian. So I needed to, work on that. I did, as I was saying, one of the teachers earlier, I spent a week with a Norwegian soldier doing winter warrior training in the area just to get a feel for it. And like, what does it mean to be that cold? What's it like to live in a cabin where you have to dig down to the door in snow and stay there without a fire? And so it was an adventure. And I'm not sure my wife appreciated the long trips when we had young children when I was in Norway, but that's a long answer to a short question. Sorry. Yes, sir.
You started off talking about the slurfish of these Norwegians. What's your takeaway? Why were these 8 men able to do what 2 companies of British run able to do?
Yeah, I think it goes down to one sort of very tangible thing and one intangible thing. And the intangible thing, of course, is why they were fighting, right? When they were directed to the question of, what are you fighting for? To an individual, they were talking about, I'm fighting for Rjukan. I'm fighting for this village. I want the Germans out of here. And all of them, of the Grouse team and many of the others, had very similar answers to that question. So it was a very sort of local motivation. And then the other thing is they knew what they were doing out there, right? I mean, Skinnerland and the others, born with skis on their feet. They knew how to survive in this weather. They knew what to wear. They knew how to hunt. They knew the people. And so without that sort of local knowledge and local ability, I just don't think that anyone else could have pulled it off without an extreme amount of training. Because they didn't have that much training. I mean, you saw Skinnerland, had a week, and then, he was never caught. He survived the war. Well, thank you all so much for paying attention and listening. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.